Here's the introduction for your YouTube video story. I always thought I knew my grandfather. He was the quiet type, the kind of man who preferred to listen rather than speak. He carried an old leather wallet that smelled like history, told the same three jokes at every family gathering, and never left the house without his favorite hat. To me, he was just Grandpa, a kind, simple man with a gentle smile. But one evening, everything I believed about him changed. It started with an old wooden chest in our attic. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just sorting through forgotten things when I stumbled upon it. The chest was covered in dust, its metal lock rusted with age. It wasn't locked, though, and something about that felt intentional, like it had been waiting to be opened. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid, revealing a collection of letters, photographs, and something that made my heart pound. An old key wrapped carefully in a faded cloth. At first, I thought it was nothing more than keepsakes, fragments of a life before I was born. But as I sifted through the papers, I found a photograph that made my breath catch. It was a picture of my grandfather, younger than I'd ever seen him, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. They looked serious, almost tense, as if the picture had captured a moment they weren't supposed to share. But what sent a chill down my spine wasn't the unfamiliar face, it was the name scribbled on the back. A name I had never heard before, a name that wasn't my grandfather's. I could have put the photo back. I could have walked away, let the past stay buried where it clearly wanted to remain. But something inside me wouldn't let go. I needed to know the truth. Who was this man? Why did my grandfather have a different name? And what did that key open? That night, I sat at my desk, spreading the letters out in front of me. Some were written in a language I didn't understand. Others were in English but full of cryptic messages, dates, and names that meant nothing to me. At least not yet. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this a secret love story? A hidden past my family had never spoken of? Or was it something darker, something that could change the way I saw my grandfather forever? I had to know. But the more I searched for answers, the more questions I uncovered. And then, just as I was beginning to piece things together, my mother walked into the room, her eyes landing on the photo in my hand. She froze. The color drained from her face. And in that moment, I knew, whatever secret my grandfather had been hiding, it was big enough to shake my entire family. What I didn't know was that I was about to uncover something none of us were prepared for. My mother didn't say a word at first. She just stared at the photograph in my hand, her lips slightly parted like she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the right words. I had never seen her like that before. My mother was always the strong one in our family, the one who handled problems with calm logic, never letting emotions get the best of her. But in that moment, she looked afraid. "Where did you find this?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the attic," I said, "inside an old chest." She reached out, hesitated for a second, then took the photo from me. Her fingers traced the faded edges, her eyes locked on the unfamiliar man beside my grandfather. I watched as she swallowed hard, like she was trying to push down a memory she didn't want to resurface. "I need you to put everything back," she said suddenly, her voice firm now. That wasn't the reaction I expected. No curiosity, no questions, just an immediate demand to bury it all again. That only made me more determined. "Who is he?" I asked, pointing to the stranger in the photo. "And why does Grandpa have a different name written on the back?" She shook her head. "It's complicated." That was the worst answer she could have given me. Complicated meant secrets. Complicated meant something had been hidden, intentionally. "I deserve to know," I pushed. She sighed, rubbing her temples like the weight of the past had just settled on her shoulders. "Your grandfather, he wasn't always the man you knew." "What does that even mean?" I asked. my heart pounding now. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat down at the edge of my bed, still holding the photo, staring at it like she was seeing something beyond the image itself. "There are things in life that are better left in the past," she finally said, "things that don't change who a person is today." That answer didn't sit right with me. If it didn't change anything, then why was she so shaken? I looked back at the letters on my desk, the unfamiliar handwriting, the different languages, the key wrapped in cloth. This wasn't just some old family story. This was something my grandfather had deliberately hidden, and my mother knew more than she was willing to admit. "I can't just forget about this," I said, "not when it's about our own family." She sighed again, this time deeper, longer. "I need to think," she said. "Don't go looking for more until I tell you what you need to know." And just like that, she left the room, taking the photo with her. But she had underestimated me. I wasn't going to let this go. If she wouldn't tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to the photo, the letters, and my mother's reaction. It was clear she knew something, something big, but she wasn't ready to share it. That only made me more restless. If this was nothing, why did she look so shaken? If the past didn't matter, why was she so desperate to keep it buried? I waited until the house was completely silent before I crept back to the attic. My mother had taken the photograph, but the rest of the chest's contents were still there. I pulled out the letters again, my fingers shaking slightly as I unfolded one at random. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but I could still make out certain words. Some were in English, others in a language I couldn't understand. But one thing stood out, a date, 1964. That didn't make sense. My grandfather would have been in his 20s then, but as far as I knew, he had spent his entire life in the same small town where he raised our family. So why did these letters suggest he had been somewhere else? And why was there mention of someone named Elias, a name I had never heard before? I kept digging, my heart pounding harder with each new discovery. There were more photographs, some showing my grandfather in places I didn't recognize, with people I had never seen before. One letter, written in rushed handwriting, had the words, "They can't know, burn everything," scribbled at the bottom. What couldn't we know? And who was this message meant for? A sudden creak from the hallway made me freeze. Footsteps. My mother? I quickly shoved the letters back into the chest and closed it, my pulse racing. But as I turned toward the attic door, I realized something terrifying. The footsteps weren't coming from inside the house. They were coming from outside, right beneath the attic window. Someone was there, watching. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just stood there, frozen in the dim attic light, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Someone was walking just beneath the window, pausing every few steps like they were searching for something or someone. I inched toward the window as quietly as possible, careful not to make a sound. My hands were trembling as I pushed aside the thin curtain and peered out. The night was dark, but the dim glow from the street lamp cast just enough light to see the silhouette of a man standing in our yard. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking up, right at the attic window. A cold wave of fear rushed over me. He saw me. I stepped back too quickly, knocking over a small wooden box in the process. The sound echoed through the attic like a gunshot. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I needed to get out of there, now. I grabbed the key from the chest and stuffed it into my pocket before slipping out of the attic as quietly as I could. My hands were slick with sweat as I reached for the doorknob to my bedroom, but just as I turned it, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock. Not at the front door, not at the back, at my window. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the shadow of someone standing just outside the glass. Whoever it was, they were waiting. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Then my phone buzzed on my nightstand, shattering the silence. I grabbed it with shaking fingers. The number was unknown. No name, just a message. Stop looking. Some secrets aren't meant to be found. I nearly dropped the phone. My chest was tight, my mind racing. Whoever was outside knew exactly what I had been doing. And worse, they wanted me to stop. But after everything I had uncovered, there was no way I was walking away. Because now I had more questions than ever. And I was going to get answers, no matter what it cost. My hands were still shaking as I read the message again. Stop looking. Some secrets aren't meant to be found. The words felt like a warning. No, more than that. A threat. Someone didn't just know what I had discovered. They were watching me. I swallowed hard, my pulse thudding in my ears. My first instinct was to check the window again, but when I pulled the curtain back, the shadow was gone. The yard below was empty, just a stretch of darkness and swaying tree branches. Whoever had been there had vanished. I wanted to believe I had imagined it all, that the message was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. Someone was trying to keep me from learning the truth about my grandfather, and that only made me more determined. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay awake, my fingers wrapped around the old key in my pocket. If someone wanted to stop me, that meant there was something worth finding, something hidden. And I had a feeling this key was part of it. By morning, I had a plan. I needed to talk to the one person who might have answers, my grandfather. But when I went downstairs, my mother was already waiting for me, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed like she hadn't slept either. "Grandpa's gone," she said, her voice tight. I stared at her. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "He left early this morning. Didn't say where he was going." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "But he took his old suitcase with him." A sinking feeling formed in my stomach. My grandfather never went anywhere without telling us, and he hadn't used that suitcase in years. I pulled out my phone, my fingers moving before I even thought. I dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same thing. Panic crept in. Had he run away because of what I found? Or was something bigger happening? Then my phone buzzed. Another message from the unknown number. "Too late. He knows you're looking. Now we're looking for him." I felt the blood drain from my face. Whoever was watching me wasn't just after the truth. They were after my grandfather. I felt my stomach drop. Whoever sent that message wasn't just watching me, they were after my grandfather. And I had no idea if he even knew. I grabbed my jacket and rushed out the door before my mother could stop me. I didn't have a plan, only a gut feeling that I needed to find him before they did. My only clue was the key. If he left because of what I uncovered, then whatever this key opened had to be important. I drove straight to his house, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I arrived, the front door was locked. I knocked, called his name, nothing. But then I remembered something. The small shed behind his house. He always kept things in there that he didn't want anyone to find. Heart pounding, I ran to the back and tried the key. It fit. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but my eyes immediately landed on a metal box sitting in the corner. I flipped it open, and my breath caught. Inside were more letters, more photographs. But this time, there were also passports, different names, different identities. And then I heard the floor creak behind me. I turned fast, expecting the worst, but it was my grandfather. His face was tired, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly. "Who are you?" My voice barely came out. He sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. I was someone else before this life, before this family, and now they want to erase me. I barely had time to process his words before the sound of tires screeching outside sent chills down my spine. My grandfather grabbed my arm. They found me. And just like that, everything I thought I knew shattered. My grandfather wasn't just hiding a secret, he was running from one. The next few seconds felt like a blur. My grandfather grabbed the metal box, his hands steady despite the fear in his eyes. Outside, car doors slammed shut. Footsteps crunched against gravel. Whoever was after him had arrived. "We need to go," he whispered. I didn't argue. I followed him out through the back door of the shed, my heart hammering against my ribs. We cut through the trees, moving quickly, staying low. I wanted to ask 100 questions, but there was no time. After a few minutes, we stopped near an old dirt road. My grandfather finally turned to me, breathing heavily. "Listen to me," he said. "I never meant for you to find any of this. I changed my name, started over, built a family. But the past doesn't just disappear." I swallowed hard. "Who are they?" "People I thought I had escaped," he said. "People who don't forgive." A distant voice shouted from the direction of the shed. They were looking for us. My grandfather reached into the box, pulled out a small notebook, and placed it in my hands. "Everything you need to know is in here," he said. "But you have to make a choice. You can dig deeper or let it go." I stood there, gripping the notebook, watching as the truck disappeared down the road. The voices from the shed grew fainter. I could still go back, still pretend none of this had happened. But as I looked down at the notebook in my hands, I knew the truth. My grandfather had spent his words felt heavy, like they carried more weight than I could understand in that moment. Before I could respond, he stepped onto the road, waving down a passing truck. The driver slowed, and my grandfather turned back one last time. "Tell your mother I love her." And then he was gone.